What if your fear of the next market crash isn't just financial? It's 3,000 years old. In one generation, the most advanced civilizations on Earth didn't decline. They vanished. Today we're going to show you why that collapse is still running in the background of your brain every time you check your portfolio. Right now, somewhere on Earth, a cargo ship is stuck. A chip factory is short one rare mineral. A shipping lane is being rerouted because of a war nobody predicted a year ago. And every time it happens, a headline says the same thing: supply chain crisis. We treat this like a modern problem. Fragile microchips, global logistics, just-in-time manufacturing. Surely humanity has never built something this interconnected, this complex, this breakable before. It has. Around 1200 BCE, the late Bronze Age Mediterranean was, for its time, the most interconnected system on the planet. Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite Empire in modern Turkey, New Kingdom Egypt, Cyprus, the Levantine trade cities like Ugarit. They weren't isolated kingdoms. They were a network. Royal courts wrote letters to each other like business partners. Egyptian gold moved north. Cypriot copper and Anatolian tin moved into the forges that made bronze, the only alloy hard enough to make a sword or a plow blade in that era. Grain moved between empires during famine years. It was, in every meaningful sense, a global economy, just 3,200 years earlier than ours. And here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. To the people living inside it, it looked permanent. It looked like the natural, obvious order of the world. That is exactly the psychological blind spot we're going to keep coming back to. High-functioning complexity doesn't feel fragile from the inside. It feels like stability. The unease you feel when a market wobbles might be less about the specific headline and more about a much older, harder-to-name suspicion. That stability this smooth is usually hiding stress fractures underneath. By 1150 BCE, almost every major power in that network was gone, crippled, or unrecognizable. Not slowly. Within about one human lifetime. This video is about what actually happened, and why the shape of that collapse still lives in the part of your brain that reacts to a red stock ticker like it's a fire alarm. Let's be precise, because the real story is scarier than the myth. For decades, popular history blamed one dramatic villain, the Sea Peoples, a mysterious raiding confederation that shows up in Egyptian inscriptions burning cities down the coast. It's a great story. It's also incomplete. The current archaeological consensus is that the Bronze Age collapse was caused by multiple, overlapping stressors hitting an already brittle system at the same time. A prolonged climate shift bringing drought and crop failure across the eastern Mediterranean. A documented cluster of major earthquakes damaging infrastructure in cities across the same 50-year window. The Sea Peoples and other displaced populations moving and raiding as their own homelands failed. Internal revolts as Hungary. Populations turned on weakened palace administrations. And this is the part that connects directly to today. A trade network so specialized and interdependent that no single kingdom could function without the others. That last point is the hinge of this entire video. Bronze required tin. Tin, in this system, largely came from a small number of distant sources, some evidence points as far as Central Asia and Western Europe, routed through middlemen across thousands of miles. If any link in that chain broke, a port destroyed, a trade route cut, a partner kingdom collapsed, the entire military and agricultural technology of the Bronze Age seized up at once. You couldn't make new weapons. You couldn't easily repair plows. This wasn't a war economy. It was a system of systems, and systems of systems don't fail one piece at a time. They fail together, fast, because the same interdependence that made them efficient made them fragile. Sound familiar? Swap tin for semiconductors. Swap Ugarit's port for the Suez Canal or Taiwan. The 2021 chip shortage, the Suez blockage, 2020's toilet paper panic. None of those were about the actual item running out globally. They were about one node in a hyper-optimized network failing, and the whole system not having enough slack to absorb it. That is the Bronze Age lesson, almost word for word. Efficiency and fragility are the same trait, viewed from two different moments in time. Here's what most retellings skip: what it actually felt like to be alive for this. We have direct evidence, not speculation, but surviving clay tablets of the final years. From Ugarit, a major trade city on the Syrian coast, A letter from the king to a Cypriot ally survives, describing enemy ships already burning nearby towns while he waits, essentially, for help that isn't coming. The tablet was found still baked in the destruction layer of the city itself. It was being fired in the kiln when the city burned, meaning it was never even sent. That's not a metaphor. That is a message frozen in the exact moment its world ended. Multiply that single letter by every palace archive, every port, every farming village across the eastern Mediterranean, and you start to get a sense of the texture of this collapse. It wasn't one dramatic battle. It was months and years of creeping systemic failure, grain shipments that didn't arrive, garrisons that couldn't be paid, allies who stopped answering letters because they were dealing with their own collapse. Writing itself disappeared in several regions for centuries afterward. Linear B script in Greece simply stops. Populations in some areas dropped sharply and never fully recovered for generations. This is what historians mean when they call it a dark age. Not a moral judgment, but a literal information blackout, where we lose the historical record because the administrative systems that produced records were gone. If there's a generational memory encoded anywhere in human behavior, this is plausibly one of the events that could have shaped it. Not a quick disaster you recover from, but the slow, grinding realization that the system you built your life around simply isn't coming back, and that the people in charge saw it coming and couldn't stop it either. Now, the honest caveat before we go further. No neuroscientist can point to a gene and say this is your Bronze Age collapse fear response. That specific claim doesn't exist, and this video isn't going to pretend it does. But here's what is real, and it's arguably more useful than the myth. Loss aversion, the well-documented finding from behavioral economics that losses register roughly twice as psychologically intense as equivalent gains, isn't unique to modern trading floors. It shows up across cultures, ages, and even in some animal studies, which suggests it's not a quirk of capitalism. It's closer to a deep, general feature of how brains evaluate risk. Separately, scarcity psychology research shows that when resources become genuinely uncertain, food, money, security, cognition narrows and shifts almost entirely toward threat monitoring, often at the cost of long-term planning. You don't need a specific memory of Bronze Age Ugarit for that wiring to make sense. You just need to accept that for the overwhelming majority of human history, sudden systemic scarcity, famine, war, the collapse of a trade network you depended on, was a survival-level event, not a portfolio inconvenience. Brains that treated the network I depend on might be failing as a five-alarm signal outcompete brains that shrugged it off. The Bronze Age collapse is simply one of the most vivid, well-documented historical examples of exactly the kind of event that pressure would have come from. So when your stomach drops at a market alert, that's not a design flaw. It's a very old, very well-calibrated alarm system, tuned for a world of total systemic collapse, going off in a world that mostly gives you partial, recoverable downturns instead. So where are today's tin routes? Where's the fragile node holding up a system that feels permanent? Start with energy. A huge share of global trade and manufacturing still runs, functionally, on a small number of choke points. The Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, geographic bottlenecks not unlike the handful of ports that moved Bronze Age tin. Disrupt one, and prices ripple through economies that have never even heard of the place. Then semiconductors, arguably the bronze of the 21st century, in the sense that almost nothing modern functions without them, and their production is concentrated in a strikingly small number of facilities, heavily reliant on a handful of countries and a handful of companies. A disruption in that supply doesn't just delay a new phone. It stalls cars, medical devices, and military hardware simultaneously, the exact system of systems fragility from earlier. Then debt and interest rate interdependence. Economies today are financially networked in a way no Bronze Age kingdom could have imagined, which means a shock in one country's banking system or one over-leveraged institution can move markets on the other side of the planet within hours, not months. None of this means collapse is imminent. It means the same structural principle applies. The more efficient and interconnected a system becomes, the less slack it has to absorb shocks. Here's the uncomfortable answer. It's both. The instinct that makes you flinch at a falling market is the same instinct that, historically, made people pay attention to genuine early warning signs. Grain prices climbing, allies going quiet, trade routes getting less reliable. People did see the Bronze Age collapse coming in fragments. Ugarit's own final letters show a king who knew something was catastrophically wrong before the end. The instinct isn't broken. It's just miscalibrated for scale. It doesn't distinguish well between a 4% market correction and the total end of the trade network I depend on for survival. Because for most of human history, those categories didn't really exist separately. So the takeaway isn't ignore the fear, and it isn't trust the fear completely. It's this. The same instinct that makes headlines about supply chains and interest rates feel like existential threats is also the instinct that, calibrated correctly, helps you notice real structural fragility before it becomes a crisis, in your own finances or in the systems you depend on. The Bronze Age didn't collapse because people ignored the warning signs. In several documented cases, they saw them and simply didn't have the flexibility left in the system to respond. That's the actual lesson underneath the metaphor. Complexity isn't the enemy. Complexity without slack is. And whether that's a 1200 BCE trade network or a 2020 supply chain, the fragility looks the same from the inside. Stable, right up until it isn't.